I'm Dr. Duke, and this is The New American. I got to tell you, if there ever was a concrete example of what happens when the federal government and the American people allow the federal government, and that includes Congress and the Senate and the president, to disregard our borders, it is what happened this week in northern Mexico. La Mora, an organization, an offshoot of the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints, rather a small community of rather extreme believers in certain aspects of Mormonism. They left the country to live in northern Mexico, even though they have American citizenship. And they've had their own little community. And by all accounts, that they have lived a peaceful life. They have lived a productive life. They seem to have bothered no one. They were ruthlessly gunned down. 6 children, 3 adults, 9 people altogether were murdered by these cartels, these lawless cartels. And if you've been paying any attention to what's been happening in Mexico, we know that the cartels are radically out of control. Journalists, politicians, high-ranking members of the military being kidnapped and beheaded, bodies and being hung from highway overpasses as the cartels send a message to Mexico and to the United States and to the world that they're lawless and they are in control. We think about the rampant border crossings in Texas and Arizona areas, and we ask ourselves, to what degree has the cartel been involved? We know they have been in smuggling drugs, child smuggling, sexual slavery campaigns back and forth across the border. This is a really serious issue, and it's one that Democrats will not talk about. You try to get a comment on the violence on the border, and the progressives will not speak about it because it completely undermines one of their major talking points, that the vast majority of people who come to this country are just refugees. That's a lie. They're not. Most of the people crossing our southern border are not in imminent political or personal danger. The Democrats in the immigration committees, legal immigration lawyers, right, and then radical progressives in this country and around the world, including at the UN, have sort of cozened the American people into believing that everyone crossing the border is crossing because their lives are in imminent danger. It's not true. They are not refugees, most of them. They do not deserve refugee status, most of them. And then when you think about all of the drugs, the corruption, the sexual slaving that's going on, the influence of the cartels over the last 5 years have been shooting across the border. They have been targeting ICE agents. They have been working with coyotes to smuggle guns back and forth. This is a big mess. Donald Trump is right. Donald Trump has been consistent from the moment he took the presidency. This has to stop. We have to get control of our immigration process. We have to be responsibly in charge of our borders. When you don't, this kind of lawlessness spreads. And now we find 9 American citizens brutally gunned down by the cartels. And if you've been watching the news, there's not a lot of noise about this. There's not a lot of CNN, MSNBC. There's not a lot of the usual talking heads. Imagine, let's say that this took place 80 miles north of this part of northern Mexico, right in the southern portion of Arizona. If you had a gang of white supremacists who shot and killed a family, including 6 children and 3 adults, the anti-gun nuts, the anti-NRA types, the Antifa, all the Democrat politicians, every one of the Democrat presidential candidates would be screaming about gun control, would be screaming about safety, would be screaming about making our children safe from all this violence. But those people now are silent because the murderers here are absolute extremist, lunatic cartel members. And so this shows you the hypocrisy of not just the Democrats and the progressive left, but of our entire policy when it comes to immigration. You've said this many times on the show here, that one of the few clearly defined roles for the federal government when it comes to the Constitution is protecting our borders. When politicians take office at the highest levels, whether they're judges at the Supreme Court, whether they're the president, whether members of Congress or Senate, they are vowing to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, which means at the federal level, enforcing those rules, those things that the founders envisioned for the governing bodies of this country, and that particularly includes border control. And now you have a situation where you have the progressive left and the radicals demanding open borders. What's happening? We've already seen these so-called refugees bringing diseases back to America that have been spreading all across California, all across the southern states. Things that used to be eradicated in this country through vaccinations are now things like typhus and tuberculosis are making a comeback. Measles now outbreaks all across the Southwest because these people are coming and we're not allowed to process them. You remember famously when Donald Trump the detention centers where he would take children and separate them from their parents, exactly what Barack Obama had done for a variety of reasons. How do we don't even know that in many cases these are actually the parents of these children. We do not know if these children have been raped or violated by the people who seem to be caring for them. This is a huge mess that the Democrats have made worse by insisting minimal processing for these people. If the Democrats had their way, they would cross over into America and we'd give them at the taxpayer dime free health care, driver's license, and a whole bunch of papers and legal representation to make sure that they're treated well. No processing, no vetting whatsoever. Now you have this brutal tragedy in for La Mora, this organization, this small religious commune, an offshoot of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And again, the mainstream media remains largely silent about this. Donald Trump said something pretty bold. He said, we need to go to war against these cartels. We need to go to war against this. It's not just a Mexican problem anymore. This is involving ICE agents. It's involving the border. It's involving who crosses the border. It's about the trafficking of guns and actual human beings back and forth. So how did the president of Mexico respond to this? Pretty much like you'd expect. He said, President Obrador, my policy is hugs, not guns. Literally, his policy is hugs and gentle persuasion and rational discourse. We're going to fight these brutal and bloody cartels with hugs, not bullets, because, as Obrador says, the bullets and the wars make things worse. Maybe, just maybe, it's going to take a war. And I don't mean a war by full-blown American involvement. I think there needs to be a very strong response to this. And if this is what it takes to get the military, certain aspects of the military, even the National Guard, to begin to occupy places along the southern border, that has a twofold benefit. It sends a message to the Mexican cartels that the president of Mexico will not send. That the kind of lawlessness and the kind of chaos and anarchy that has engulfed Mexico is beginning to make its way to the United States. One of the other things we're importing, what people don't quite realize this, we're not just importing people, we're not just importing refugees, we're not just importing unassimilated Americans who have not been properly vetted. We are also importing, with these open border policies in the South, we're importing the kind of anarchy and chaos into our country that has engulfed Mexico. And I think that if this becomes more of an American problem, as we will see, as the cartels and dangerous men, coyotes on the borders, begin to make these deeper and more profound incursions into America, you're going to reach a point at which the American people will demand action. It's one thing for these cartels to shoot up Mexican tourists to Mexico. Perhaps it's even one thing to murder these 9 people, these Americans living in northern Mexico. But it's another thing when this violence sort of comes to your own city. I would love to ask Beto O'Rourke, that preening moron who just dropped out of the race, love to ask him from his perch in El Paso how he feels about this. Is this just one of this kind of murder? Is this just one of the prices we have to pay for open borders? Again, think about this. The majority of the world is not what you and I would call civilized. The majority of the world does not operate under the rule of law. Most countries in the world do not have rights and protections for citizens. They do not have rights and protections for legal immigration. They don't have rules and regulations to protect civil rights and human rights. These countries now, and the people who come from these countries, are bringing that anarchic position to America with them. America has a lot to lose. The degree to which America becomes more like the third and second world countries from which these refugees come, the less this place will be a haven for actual refugees, for the American dream, those who seek opportunity. And not only is it going to be less of a refuge for people who need a refuge, it's also going to minimize the quality of life in America. It's going to make much more dangerous the world we inhabit. If we don't, at some level, even if it's just intellectually and in terms of money, if we don't take this war, this battle, to Mexico, the Mexican government who is enabling this, and the cartels, then we are complicit as well. And that violence and that anarchy and that lawlessness will become part of our culture. You're already seeing it now on the border with the diseases we talked about before, the reckless disregard for our laws and our federal rules, and even personhood. And finally now, it's come to murder. It's time to do something about this. Donald Trump has the right idea. Democrats, it's time to act. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Dr. Duke with The New American, and this has been my take on the news.